She fell out the window upstairs on the second floor.
Okay, are you there
And
with
she
her?
laying on the ground, butt naked.
Are you with her right now?
I'm right here right now. She laying on the ground, butt naked.
The woman found here was just one of many who either went missing or suffered abuse at the hands of the man who lived in this house. After 2 years, the decomposing remains of these 11 women were found inside, making neighbors realize that the awful smell lingering in the air wasn't from a sausage factory, but from this very house, and it became known as the True House of Horrors. This case was so disturbing that even after his acquittal, many still believe the so-called Cleveland Strangler had more than 11 victims. That's because several other murders in this town remain unsolved to this day, and all the victims were women.
I know one thing about I think always made me mad is they had kids.
And they was out in the street.
Yeah. That's a big thing in my head.
So today, we remember them, because no troubled past can ever justify what they went through. And once you hear the full story, you'll understand exactly why.
I don't know. I think I just
Choked them.
nothing like for beat,
Yeah.
No.
His name was Anthony Sowell, the man you saw casually describing how he killed his victims in that video. And like many serial killers before him, he had a troubled past. A past that shaped his twisted view of women, seeing them as nothing more than objects he could torture, harass, and kill. Anthony was one of 7 children born to Claudia Garrison, a single mother struggling to raise them all. But tragedy struck when one of Claudia's daughters, Anthony's sister, passed away, leaving behind 7 children of her own. With nowhere else to go, they moved in with Claudia, bringing the total number of kids in the household to 14. Now, you might have heard the old rhyme about the lady who lived in a shoe and had so many kids she didn't know what to do. But this was no nursery tale. According to Anthony's niece, Leona, who was one of the 7 children forced to move in, their time in that house was pure misery. Claudia subjected them to brutal beatings and relentless abuse, while her own 7 children watched from the sidelines. In one of the most horrifying moments of her childhood, Leona recalled how Claudia, the very woman who was supposed to protect and care for her, forced her to strip naked and then brutally beat her. In a later interview, Leona recalls this horrifying experience, saying,
"She would tie us up to the pole and strip us butt naked and beat us. And then I went through the rape with Anthony and a couple of my other family members in the home."
But the nightmare didn't stop there. Claudia's own children were reportedly spared from the worst of her wrath, but for Leona and the other girls in the house, the abuse was relentless. Now, according to Leona, one of Claudia's older sons also took part in the cruelty, routinely beating and assaulting the young girls. Tragically, it didn't stop at just one person. It's said that other male relatives living in the house joined in, creating a cycle of unspeakable violence and trauma. Leona also revealed that Anthony Sowell was often silent during these horrific acts. He never intervened. Instead, he would sit back and watch as the abuse happened right in front of him. But what Leona didn't realize was that for Anthony, witnessing mistreatment had become almost normal. Growing up in a home where abuse was a daily occurrence, he began imitating the cruelty he saw. Shockingly, at just 11 years old, he started molesting his own 10-year-old niece, Leona's sister, subjecting her to the same suffering he had witnessed, continuing the cycle of pain that had been ingrained in their home. Fast forward to January 24, 1978, Anthony joined the United States Marine Corps. Surprisingly, he excelled in the military. Over the next 7 years, he built an impressive record, earning multiple Good Conduct medals, certificates, ribbons, and letters of appreciation. By all accounts, his military career was defined by discipline, hard work, and achievements. And upon his honorable discharge in 1985, Anthony returned home to Cleveland. For a while, he managed to live a relatively normal life. But that facade crumbled 4 years later, in 1989, when he committed his first known violent crime. It all started with Melvette Stockwell, a 3-month pregnant woman and an S worker who believed she was simply meeting a new client. On that fateful night, she accompanied Anthony to his home, expecting a routine exchange, do the job, get paid, and leave. But this wasn't like her other clients. As soon as they stepped inside, the charm disappeared. Anthony's entire demeanor shifted. He suddenly became aggressive, grabbing her before she could react. He tied her hands and feet with zip ties and a belt, gagging her with a rag to keep her from screaming. She was completely at his mercy. But then he stopped. Instead of attacking her right away, he told her he was going to feed her before he killed her. Imagine hearing that. You think you're about to meet your end, but instead, your captor is talking about feeding you first, like you're on some twisted death row. The horror of that moment must have been unimaginable. But then, out of nowhere, Anthony decided to take a nap before going through with his plan. That was her only chance. In a moment of sheer desperation, she managed to break free, escape through a window, and signal for help from the rooftop. A neighbor spotted her and called the police, and when officers arrived, they found her shaking and terrified. But miraculously, she had survived. Anthony was arrested and charged with rape, attempted rape, and kidnapping. In 1989, 3 women from the same street as Anthony had already been murdered. As it turned out, Anthony was already on the authorities' radar, but despite the charges against him, he pleaded guilty to a rape and was sentenced to only 5 to 15 years in prison. While behind bars, Anthony underwent multiple psychological evaluations, yet he continuously insisted he would never commit such acts again. Despite his disturbing past, Anthony managed to convince the system that he had reformed. What's even more chilling is that he was not classified as a sex offender, meaning that when he was released in 2005, he was free to roam the streets of Cleveland, Ohio, just like any other citizen. That same year, he moved into 122205 Imperial Avenue, a house that would soon become infamous. However, 2 years later, Anthony lost his job at a local factory under mysterious circumstances. Unemployed, he began collecting benefits and making money on the side by working as a scrap metal collector. But as his financial situation deteriorated, so did his mental state. He became more withdrawn, spending most of his time in his house, avoiding neighbors, and becoming more erratic in his behavior. Those who lived nearby noticed a change in him as he looked unkempt, distant, and was no longer the same person they had once known. Then came the turning point. Anthony began a relationship with a woman named Lori, a niece of the governor in Cleveland, and they quickly spiraled into a toxic cycle of heavy drug use, particularly crack. But while Anthony was sinking deeper into addiction, Lori wanted out. And so, in 2007, when Anthony was fired from his job at the factory, Lori saw it as her chance to break free. She left him, determined to leave that world behind. Anthony, however, was far from ready to let go. The heartbreak shattered something inside him, sending him into a dark spiral. He stayed behind on Imperial Avenue, but from that moment on, his reclusive tendencies became even more pronounced. He withdrew into himself, his behavior becoming more unstable. And then the horrors began. That same year, a 10-year-old girl living nearby vanished without a trace. Just months later, another woman, a 33-year-old nursing assistant named Tashana Culver, disappeared. Tashana had struggled with drug addiction, but she was also a dedicated healthcare worker, trying her best to turn her life around. No one reported her missing, no police alerts, no flyers, just another woman gone. 2 months later, 25-year-old LaShonda Long, a mother of 3, also vanished. Then, in October of 2008, 45-year-old Michelle Mason, who had 2 sons and was a devoted volunteer for the local AIDS task force, was also reported missing. Her mother, terrified, went to the police in early December. She begged them to look into her daughter's disappearance, but nothing happened. The case remained open, and no one connected the dots. Meanwhile, over on Imperial Avenue, a gut-wrenching stench was growing worse by the day. The entire neighborhood complained. A smell so rancid it made people gag just walking past. And the most disturbing part? Anthony Sowell himself reeked of it. Whenever someone wrinkled their nose and questioned the putrid odor clinging to him, Sowell had a ready excuse. "It's that damn sausage factory next door," he'd say with a shrug. And somehow, people believed him. After all, Ray's Sausage had been in business for over 5 decades, and well, it was a meat factory. Maybe it really did stink. But the complaints kept piling up. Eventually, City Hall got involved, sending inspectors to investigate. The pressure was on, and Ray's Sausage was forced to take drastic action, spending over $30,000 on deep cleaning, new ventilation systems, and odor-eliminating technology. And yet, the smell didn't go away. It clung to the air, thick and putrid. By this time, Sowell was unraveling. In early December of 2008, a terrified woman ran straight to a police car parked in the neighborhood, bleeding, shaking, and screaming. She claimed Sowell had attacked her, dragged her inside his house, choked her, and attempted to assault her. When police stormed Sowell's foul-smelling home and arrested him, he had his own version of the story, insisting that she was the criminal, that she had tried to rob him. Both bore scratches and bruises, making it difficult for officers to determine who was telling the truth. With no clear evidence, both were arrested but later released due to insufficient proof. Just a month later, in January of 2009, Kim Smith, a 44-year-old woman who had been caring for her elderly father, disappeared. That year alone, 5 more women, Nancy Cobbs, Imelda Hunter, Janice Webb, Talisha Fortson, and Diane Turner, vanished without a trace. The alarming number of missing women in such a small area didn't go unnoticed by the community. Residents began organizing searches, handing out flyers, and trying to bring attention to the disappearances. Shockingly, Anthony himself joined these efforts, blending in with those who were desperately searching for the very women he had taken. Then came October of 2009. A woman named Shawn Morris visited Anthony's house, seemingly unfazed by the overpowering stench that clung to the air. The two spent the evening drinking, using drugs, and talking. Nothing intimate, just casual conversation. The next morning, as she prepared to leave, she realized she had left her ID upstairs. As she walked up to retrieve it, she suddenly heard a chilling click sound from behind her. Before she could react, Anthony lunged at her, attacking her without warning. He overpowered her, assaulted just like so many before her, and then went through the house, locking all the doors and windows. It became clear that he had no intention of letting her go. But Shawn saw a fleeting moment of opportunity, one she knew she had to take. Summoning all her strength, she threw herself out of a 3rd-story window, crashing 30 feet to the ground below. Anthony, realizing what had happened, bolted downstairs, completely unclothed, desperate to drag her back inside. But this time, fate wasn't on his side. 2 passers-by witnessed the horrifying scene and immediately called 911. The call you already heard back in the intro. Because of them, Shawn was rushed to the hospital with severe injuries, including multiple broken bones. Despite the brutal attack, she chose not to speak to the police about what had happened. However, someone else would. Just a week later, on October 27th, a woman named Latundra Billups came forward to share her own horrifying experience with Anthony Sowell. She had been through a terrifying ordeal back in September, one that followed the same pattern as before. She had gone to his house for a drink, only for him to suddenly turn violent. Unlike so many others, she was lucky enough to survive. However, the trauma had kept her silent, until now. Finally, in late October, her testimony was enough for authorities to issue both an arrest warrant and a search warrant for Anthony Sowell. On October 29th, SWAT officers stormed his house, expecting to take Anthony into custody. But what they found was far worse than they could have imagined. Anthony wasn't home, but the stench was overwhelming. Dead flies covered every surface. Then came the grisly discoveries, decomposing bodies, one after another, some of which had been rotting away for years. The house of horrors that had plagued the neighborhood for so long was finally exposed, and a manhunt was immediately launched. For 2 days, police scoured the city for Anthony Sowell. Then, on October 31st, as he casually strolled down the street, officers spotted him. They pulled over and cuffed him on the spot. He looked disheveled, with dirt and twigs clinging to his clothes, as if he had been sleeping outside, hiding in the bushes for days. But there was no hiding from what had been found in his home.
What happened in this house behind me is simply a nightmare, and there are a lot of deeply disturbing questions for authorities here. There were 6 bodies found in this house last week. This morning, we know there are more.
We discovered 4 additional, what we believe to be 4 bodies. It appears that this man had a insatiable appetite that he had to fill.
To shed light on Anthony's victims, let's get to know them before their lives were consumed by addiction, because they all had stories, dreams, and struggles. They had every reason to keep going, and there was no reason for them to be murdered. Crystal Dozier, a mother of 7, was 35 years old when she vanished in May 2007. Her son, a U.S. Marine, desperately searched for her, but she wouldn't be found until police unearthed her remains in Anthony's backyard 2 years later. Loved ones recalled that Crystal had turned to drugs after losing one of her children, a pain that consumed her. Despite her struggles, she was a devoted mother who, in another life, could have had a different ending. Tishana Culver was 33 years old, a trained nursing assistant and cosmetologist who had once envisioned a future helping others. However, tragedy struck when her boyfriend took his own life, sending her into a spiral of grief and addiction. At one point, she lived only 4 houses away from Anthony, unaware of the fate that awaited her. She disappeared in June 2008, leaving behind loved ones who never stopped wondering what had happened to her. LaShonda Long, just 25 years old, was the youngest of Anthony's victims. A mother of 3, she disappeared 3 months after Tishana. No one even filed a missing persons report for her, a heartbreaking reflection of how addiction often isolates its victims from the support they need. Her remains were never fully recovered. Only her skull was found in Anthony's basement. On the other hand, Michelle Mason had fought hard to turn her life around. At 45, she was living with HIV and had battled heroin addiction, but she refused to let her struggles define her. After surviving a shooting, she dedicated her life to helping others, working with an AIDS outreach program and focusing on her children. She disappeared on or around October 4th, 2008. Another life full of resilience and hope, cut tragically short. Tanya Carmichael was a mother, a fighter, and, tragically, the first victim to be identified from Anthony Sowell's House of Horrors. Though she struggled with substance abuse, her loved ones never stopped caring. When she vanished in December 2008, they knew something was wrong. Tanya's mother wasted no time. She reported her missing within a week, desperate for answers. But the police saw just another black woman with a drug problem and failed to take the case seriously. Even when her abandoned car was found near Sowell's neighborhood, they ignored the red flag. Years later, forensic testimony would expose the brutality of her death. Strangled with a telephone charger, discarded as if she didn't matter. But Tanya did matter. She was loved, she was missed, and her family never stopped fighting to make sure she wouldn't be forgotten. Kim Yvette Smith, 44, was a caretaker in every sense of the word. She dedicated her life to looking after her ailing father, balancing the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. In January 2009, she disappeared without a trace, leaving her father behind and breaking the hearts of those who knew her. Imelda Amy Hunter, 47, had a life marked by hardships and resilience. Raised in Chicago, she was an avid reader, a girl with dreams before her life took an unexpected turn. At just 14, she became pregnant by one of her teachers and gave birth to a child with cerebral palsy who was also deaf. This unimaginable responsibility weighed on her young shoulders, and eventually, addiction found its way into her life. Yet she was more than her struggles. She was a mother, a woman who had once been full of promise. Nancy Cobbs was a 44-year-old grandmother, deeply loved and fiercely missed. When she disappeared in April 2009, her family refused to sit idly by. They kicked in the doors of abandoned houses, desperately searching for her. Tragically, her body was only discovered months later, wrapped in 6 plastic bags. Forensic testimony later revealed that she had been strangled with a shoelace, another victim of Anthony's cruelty. Talacia Fortson, 31, had a difficult upbringing, bouncing from foster home to foster home. She frequently ran away, searching for something better, but addiction tightened its grip on her. Like Tashana and Amy, no one even realized she was missing until the bodies began surfacing. Janice Webb, 48, was last seen on June 3, 2009, at her boyfriend's home in Lakewood, Ohio, just outside Cleveland. A woman with her own battles, she never imagined that crossing paths with Anthony would be her final chapter. Diane Turner, 38, had endured the unthinkable, losing all 6 of her children to the state. The pain of separation pushed her deeper into addiction, but she was still a mother who had once held hope for her family. She was the last of Anthony's victims to disappear in September 2009, the same month that LaTundra Billups, 37, survived his brutal attack. These women were not just victims. They were women who had lived, loved, and endured unimaginable struggles. Their stories deserve to be told, not just as part of Anthony's crimes, but as a reminder of the lives that were stolen and the justice they finally received. What's particularly gut-wrenching is that by the time authorities finally captured Anthony's soul, he was 50 years old, meaning he had already spent decades living freely, committing these crimes unnoticed. His arrest on October 29, 2009, was just the beginning of a long, drawn-out legal battle. Sowell's trial was initially scheduled for June 2, 2010, but what followed was a series of postponements. His defense team argued that they needed more time to prepare, review thousands of pages of evidence, and analyze hours of surveillance footage taken from a neighboring property. The trial was pushed to September 7th, then to February 14th, then to May 2nd, and finally to June 6th, 2011. When proceedings finally began, Sowell faced 85 charges, including 11 counts of aggravated murder and 74 counts of rape, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, and tampering with evidence. His initial plea was not guilty by reason of insanity, but he later changed it to simply not guilty. Despite his attempts to evade responsibility, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Survivors testified, forensic experts detailed the gruesome conditions of his home, and jurors were confronted with horrifying photos of the crime scene. On July 22, 2011, after weeks of testimony, the jury found him guilty on all but 2 counts. The decision was clear. Anthony Sowell was a serial killer who had preyed on the most vulnerable women in his community.
We'll now read the jury's verdicts. I'll ask the defendant to please rise. With respect to the matter of State of Ohio versus Anthony Sowell, criminal case number 530885, sentencing proceedings as to count 1, Tanya Carmichael. We, the jury, being duly impaneled and sworn, do hereby find that the aggravating circumstances which the defendant was found guilty of committing do outweigh the mitigating factors presented in this case by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We therefore unanimously find that the sentence of death should be imposed upon the defendant, Anthony Sowell. All 12 jurors have signed their name to this verdict form and have not completed the additional form with respect to life without parole as directed by the court. Moving on then to count 7, sentencing proceedings relating to Nancy Cobbs.
When it came time for sentencing, the prosecution argued that Sowell showed no remorse for his crimes. The jurors agreed. On August 10th, they recommended the death penalty, and 2 days later, Judge Dick Ambrose upheld their decision. Sowell was officially sentenced to death on September 14, 2011. He was transferred to death row at Chillicothe Correctional Institution, a stark contrast to the freedom he had once used to terrorize his victims. Sowell and his attorneys spent years filing appeal after appeal, arguing that excessive media coverage, a closed courtroom, and poor legal representation had denied him a fair trial. The Ohio Supreme Court rejected his appeal in December 2016, and when he took the case to the United States Supreme Court in 2017, they declined to hear it. By May 2020, Sowell had exhausted all legal options. Then, before the state could carry out his execution, fate stepped in. On February 8, 2021, at age 61, Sowell died in a prison hospital from an unspecified terminal illness. Some speculated liver failure or cancer, but no official cause was released. He may be gone, but the nightmare he created still lingers, a haunting reminder of how he not only took lives, but lived among the dead, sleeping beside his victims' corpses. The trauma he inflicted didn't just disappear with his death, it still weighs heavy on the community. In fact, in 2021, 5 of Sowell's surviving victims bravely shared their stories and snapped, "Notorious," exposing the horrors they endured and the failures that let it happen. And here's the harsh reality. Back then, when Black women went missing, law enforcement barely lifted a finger. And let's be real, this isn't an isolated case. We've covered multiple cases just like this, including another infamous strangler from Charlotte, who also murdered 11 Black women. The red flags were everywhere, but officers failed to connect the dots. Was it carelessness, or did they just not care? Eventually, the city of Cleveland had to answer for its failures, paying out $1.3 million in settlements to the families of Sowell's victims. But here's the question. Was that justice, or just a price tag for neglect? Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think there were more victims than the ones officially linked to him? Considering the unsolved murders of women in that area, could some of those cases be connected to Sowell? Drop your thoughts below, and if you want to dive deeper into similar cases, check out our channel. We've got more to uncover. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.